Hi, I'm Darren Miles with Darren Miles Photography, based here in beautiful, sunny Southwest Florida, even though I'm standing in the middle of my studio. As many of you know who follow my channel, that I shoot a lot of real estate. In fact, I run a real estate photography seminar twice per year down here, and it represents about 60% of all the work that I do. But one big question that comes up consistently is, why don't you use tilt-shift lenses in your real estate work? Or worse, I get something like, you aren't a real estate and architectural photographer unless you shoot with tilt-shift lenses, etc. Well, there's actually a few really good reasons why I've personally opted not to use tilt-shift lenses in the past, and here's why. The widest tilt-shift lens in the marketplace is the Canon 17mm TS-E f4L lens, which, by the way, is the lens that we used in this review. Now, down here in Southwest Florida, we have a huge two-bed, two-bath condo market, and I found that at 17mm, I sometimes am shooting a bathroom, sink, or countertop rather than the room. I just found that in too many situations, 17mm just doesn't cut it as wide enough. Now, it's even worse for Nikon shooters because the widest native tilt-shift lens available for Nikon is the new 19mm PC, or perspective control, and it's only 19mm. Number two, given the complicated nature of these lenses, that is that they physically tilt and shift, they tend to be difficult to manufacture, and as a result, they're quite expensive. For example, the 17mm f4 TS-E lens, again used in this review, comes in at $2,149, and the Nikon 19mm PC perspective control lens comes in at just under $3,400, and again, it's only 19mm. Number three, it may not be a big deal to some, but it is to me. We shoot a very high volume of homes as a company, and the big downside for us is that tilt-shift lenses are manual focus. Granted, we're most often shooting somewhere around f8 to get everything in focus, but just an extra like 8, 10, or even 12 seconds times however many rooms we're going to have to shoot can add an extra 30 minutes to an hour to a day. For example, I can shoot a two-bed, two-bath condo with an autofocus lens in about 12 to 15 minutes. It takes me about 18 to 25 minutes to shoot that same home with a TS-E lens, mainly because of the lack of autofocus. Number four, you can imitate many of the looks of TS-E lenses in software today. Granted, the software isn't quite as good, but it's pretty close. Now, on the flip side, the last 30 days that I've used the Canon 17mm TS-E lens, I've gotten over a bit of a learning curve, and I understand TS-E lens is a lot better than I used to. And what I've learned is that there's definitely a time and a place to use them. And in fact, they do a better job of keeping straight lines straight without that feeling of a building tipping backwards or forwards in your shots. But I've also learned there's a time and a place where TS-E lenses make little to no sense at all. Now, if you want to understand those things, and again, at least from my perspective as a real estate photographer down here in Southwest Florida, then stick around and see how the 17mm f4 lens fared specifically for that purpose. So first up is the build, and let's face it, this is an L series lens from Canon, and Canon has spared little in its quality. It's mostly made out of metal with knobby wheels and dials that gauge the tilting and shifting mechanisms of the lens. These lenses are complicated, not only on the exterior, but on the interior as well. In fact, there are 18 elements arranged in 12 groups on the inside, and there's a floating internal focusing mechanism that delivers high image quality throughout the focus range. At least that's what Canon says. Now, speaking of the focus, these are manual focus only lenses, but at least there's focus confirmation built into the Canon bodies. And speaking of that, the focus ring is smooth and it rotates evenly with a really nice degree of feedback. Now, coming in at 820 grams, or 1.8 pounds, the 17, well, it isn't light, but it feels really well balanced when made it to the 5D Mark III that I haven't made it to here. Now, check out that golf ball shaped front element. I've gotten a ton of comments about that. People thinking that it looks like some kind of space age cool thing, but they're also under the impression that you, the photographer, know what you're doing when you show up with a lens like this. Now, on the downside, even though that front element is really cool to look at, it's also exposed, and it's really easy to bump into walls and corners if you aren't careful. And fixing one of these things, well, that isn't exactly cheap. So keep that lens cap around when you move from room to room. Now additionally, given the complex physical nature of these lenses, they're really hard to seal against the elements, and at nearly $2,200, that's unfortunately a bit of a shame. So whether sealing an exposed front element aside, the 17mm TS-E lens is a bit of a physical specimen, and as such, we give it a 9.5 out of 10 for build quality. So next up is focus accuracy, and you've probably guessed, given that the lens is manual focus, there isn't a focus motor, so focus speed is largely determined by the speed in which you rotate the focus ring with your hands. Moreover, at its widest setting of 17mm in f4, that's still a really wide depth of field, and as such, even though it's manual focus, there is electronic connectivity and focus confirmation, and in my experience, focus confirmation has been dead on accurate. But even at 17mm in f4, you can find accurate focus or accurate and sharp focus very quickly, again, given that really wide depth of field. Now, as mentioned previously, it's not as fast as using an autofocus lens, but it's reasonably efficient. However, if you shoot a lot of houses in a day or do a lot of work in a day, the TS-E 17 with its manual focus can in fact slow you down. But in a nutshell, manual focus doesn't get more accurate or more efficient than this, and as such, the TS-E 17 gets a 9.5 out of 10 for focus accuracy. So next up is optical quality and the quality of the results. As you can probably guess, for its intended purpose of architectural photography, overall, I think the 17 is pretty excellent. Optically, it's as sharp as just about any other L lens that I've used or tested, as I'm getting edge-to-edge sharpness at pretty much all apertures, with the exception of the edges at f4. But truthfully, in real estate photography, I'm shooting at f8 anyway, and at that setting, I'm getting fantastic results. And I have to say, overall, the lens does a really great job. As mentioned previously, the one major issue that I have with the 17 really has very little to do with the lens's excellent optical quality. What's happening is, too often, I find the lens simply isn't wide enough, and in those situations, you do have the option to shift the lens either vertically or horizontally, and then stitch those images together in post for what will result in a wider, distortionless photograph. The lens also has markings, so if you're bracketing your shots, it's easy to repeat the shots at various exposure levels, and I think that's great, but it's just another factor of time that you have to consider adding to a shoot when you could otherwise get a really similar result with a non-tilt shift ultra-wide lens at say 14 or 15 millimeters. And something else I didn't cover in the scope of this review is the one really cool thing that tilt shift lenses are capable of doing, and that's the miniaturization effect. It's a really neat trick that tilt shift lenses are famous for, and the 17 is no exception. In the end though, I don't have a lot to complain about the TS-E 17's optics, as my issues are more to do with the limitations of having to live or work within the confines of 17 millimeters. That said, as with all of my reviews, don't take my word for it, see for yourself. The next 2 to 3 minutes will be a series of stills and video clips taken with the Canon TS-E 17mm f4L lens, and I think you'll agree that the 17 is more than capable optically. So last up is value, and this is a bit tricky because on the one hand, you have a lens that is capable of doing something really cool optically. That is, straightening out the edges and making those buildings upright in architectural and real estate photography that a standard ultra-wide lens just can't do straight out of the camera. It's a really neat trick, and I found that it works really well, especially in big spaces like skyscrapers and train stations. But for everyday real estate photography and smaller apartments and condominiums, I find that 17mm can in fact be a frustrating limitation to get over, especially if you find yourself working in those tight spaces frequently. I found 17mm to be a bit too narrow, too often to use, and I found myself aching for my 14 to 24mm Nikon in order to get a specific shot. Again, don't get me wrong, the optics of the 17 are in fact top-notch and very typical of L-series lenses from Canon, but the real limitation is just in focal length and the price to obtain that focal length, because I can get a lot wider for a lot less money. Specifically, for example, I should say, as a Canon or Nikon shooter, I can obtain the Tamron 15 to 30mm f2.8 lens for just about half the price of the Canon 17mm TS-E. Moreover, I found that with a little bit of distortion correction in post, I can get similar, though admittedly not quite as good, results from standard ultra-wide lenses, and again, for a lot less money. So for value, the TS-E 17mm f4L gets an 8 out of 10. So to wrap up this review, we gave the Canon TS-E 17mm f4L lens a 46 out of 50 and our highly recommended rating. The final word. If you're an architectural and or real estate photographer, tilt shift lenses are, in my opinion, a nice supplement to ultra-wide angle lenses, especially for big, wide open scenes that give you a lot of room to straighten out the edges of buildings and or homes. It's a really nice effect, and it does in fact bring more realism to photographs. But in my specific line of work, I find that 17mm is more of a significant limitation than the benefit of straightening out edges that these lenses offer. Again, this is not to say that these lenses aren't optically excellent, because they are. They just don't work for me often enough in too many situations to justify their really steep price points. Again, speaking for myself, I prefer autofocus lenses that are considerably wider, because I'm not 100% sure that I could live with 17mm being the widest lens in my camera bag. I'm Darren Miles of Darren Miles Photography, based here in beautiful, sunny, in my warehouse, whatever, Southwest Florida. If you like these reviews, please don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, happy shooting.